The Next Chapter with Prim Siripipat is a production of iHeartRadio. Hey everybody, it's Prim. Welcome to The Next Chapter presented by Baron Davis and Six Studios. This week's guest is former Olympic figure skater and Stanford University graduate Rachael Flatt. As an elite athlete, Rachael was the 2008 World Junior Champion, the 2010 U.S. National Champion, and then at the 2010 Vancouver Games, she finished 7th overall in ladies figure skating. So obviously a very accomplished athlete. And it's fascinating because Rachael and I are following very, very similar paths, at least when it comes to our post-athletic careers. So she graduated from Stanford University in 2015 with a major in biology and then a minor in psychology. And today she is a Ph.D. clinical psychology student at UNC-Chapel Hill, where she is focusing much of her research and clinical training, like me, on the mental health of athletes. But she's specifically looking at eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors within the athlete population. Now, heading into this interview, I was really curious about why her transition from figure skating had been relatively easy. Because based on the research I had done, including having listened to a few other interviews, she had talked about how her retirement, specifically at the 2014 U.S. National Figure Skating Championships, was kind of great and memorable because she was able to walk away on her own terms. But, there's a but. But, as you'll hear during our conversation, my hypothesis or assumption about her retirement experiences were completely wrong. On an emotional and psychological level, it was really, really difficult for her to leave figure skating. And understandably, because it's been a part of her life since she was 4 years old. And I think what's really compelling about this conversation is, number one, even when an athlete is able to walk away on their own terms with absolutely no regrets, the transition from sport can and will most likely be hard for a lot of athletes. Because when your life and every fiber of your being is dedicated to this one thing, and then that thing ends, it's going to require some level of adjustment. And we all know change is never easy. And number two, the second point I want to highlight from this conversation is we can't make assumptions about people's experiences if we don't ask them directly. Even though Rachael had talked about retiring from figure skating in a more, kind of positive way in other interviews and on other shows, context is really important. So depending on the conversation and topic, and depending on the environment or tone, and also depending on the questions and how they were asked, all of that might lend a completely different answer. So it's really important that we provide the right setting and also ask the right questions if we really want to know the truth about something or someone, including an athlete's retirement experiences. Really hope you enjoyed this conversation. So sit back, relax, and without further ado, here's Rachael Flatt. Well, Rachael, it's so great to have you on the show. You and I have gotten the opportunity to work with one another. We're co-writing a chapter on athletes and eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors, which we're still in the process of it. But how are you doing?
I am doing really well. A little tired. The grad school fatigue is very real right now, but but otherwise doing really well.
You're a couple of years ahead of me, so you're much closer to the light at the end of the tunnel. So you're almost there. You're almost there. Yeah. Well, I'm so excited to talk about you and hit on so many different topics, but really, I wanted to focus on your transition from figure skating. So, I was kind of listening to a couple of interviews. You've done a lot of interviews, but a couple of them that I listened to, you mentioned that leaving sport for you was actually I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed like it was relatively easy after the 2014 nationals. But what was your transition like, and was it easy for you?
Yeah, I think it started easy.
Okay.
Yeah, it was really interesting because I was a junior in college at that point in time, and really had a lot of other things on my plate. I was actually pre-med at that point, and really was interested in just diving into like the collegiate environment. And I was a junior class president and had a ton of other stuff on my plate at that point, so it felt like an easy and natural kind of slide into all these other things that I had put on my plate just to kind of keep me busy. But once I graduated the following year, it really hit me that I hadn't processed my retirement at all, and also had kind of stuck with the status quo in pursuing this pre-med plan that I had kind of set up since my freshman year without really giving myself like the opportunity to question that or consider if there were alternative career paths that I wanted to pursue that maybe fit my interests a little bit better. So all of that kind of came crashing down right after I graduated. And it was a difficult year. Just trying to reevaluate what I really wanted to do and my identity, as I was no longer a competitive athlete. And I know that that's something a lot of athletes experience when you're trying to figure out your life post sport, especially when it's been something that has kind of tethered and grounded your identity and who you are as a person. So it was rough after that initial easy transition.
That is so interesting. And thank you for sharing that. I'm so glad I was more specific about my question. And that's hilarious that I could listen to something and make an assumption or make a conclusion about what you said, because I guess there is a difference, because in that particular interview, I think you were talking with Polina Edmonds on her Believe podcast, and you had mentioned that you were able to walk away with essentially kind of no regrets, and you had a sense of control over how your career ended, and yet at the same time, it was still hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I make this joke that if you look at my resume on paper, it's like, okay, it would make sense that, or it would seem as though my transition out of sport was great. And I really did get to end my career on my own terms, which I am so thankful for. I had a number of injuries for the last 4 years of my skating career, and obviously balancing skating with pre-med track at an elite college was not easy, to say the least. Yeah. But it was still really valuable in getting to work with a coaching team that I adored and really supported me as a human first and as an athlete second. So I was finally able to end my career without being injured, with a great team at my side, feeling really supported. And for that, I will always be extremely grateful, because it just helped me feel like I could walk away from skating and my competitive career feeling really at peace. But yeah, it's so interesting because, it's like I had all this stuff that I thought I would wanted to do. And I had all these things lined up for me right after I graduated and right after I retired, with a bunch of shows. And, and I just really tried to keep myself busy. And at that point didn't necessarily realize like the importance of dealing with kind of the emotional fallout of retirement.
So what was that emotional experience for you? What was the most difficult part about it?
There were a lot of things that were difficult. I mean, part of it, I think one of the most important things to that experience for me was understanding that I could kind of redefine success in my life. What I was so worried about was this feeling of having to start over from scratch. And, I didn't necessarily realize at that point that I had all these incredible skills from skating and from being in sport, and, that transferred to real life. But I just had a very narrow idea of how those skills kind of fit into sport. And so I was really worried about, people, kind of this external perception of how I would move beyond skating. And I felt this pressure to kind of immediately jump into the next career and be really successful. And so the idea, yeah. So the idea of like starting over was terrifying. And then kind of dealing with this secondary, like, oh crap, I don't really want to go to medical school. Now what? Those two things kind of as a 1-2 punch really just, threw me for a loop. And so I felt really depressed. I felt this loss of identity. I was really, I was concerned with what was coming next. So there's a lot of worrying that was happening. I kind of sat with that for the better part of a year and was not really at a point where I felt open enough to kind of share that with even my closest inner circle. And my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, I just, I was like, I gotta keep this front up. I gotta show everyone that I'm doing great. And even with him, there were times where I just finally like had to kind of let those walls down. And it just was really scary to do that and be so vulnerable when in an athletic setting, you're taught to not really show that and demonstrate that. And obviously things are starting to change there, but kind of when I was going through sport, that was the overarching sentiment, was to not show your vulnerability. So it was a lot of different things. It was complex. It was, just difficult to kind of navigate and feel really isolated in working through that. And fortunately had a lot of great people who I finally started opening up to, both athletes and non-athletes, and just kind of took the advice and the support that was really helpful over that period, and was finally able to kind of start moving through that. So it was a rough go for a little bit there, but finally made it out the other side and feel like I'm doing really well now.
Girl, I hear you. I mean, identity, check. Transition, check. Emotions, check.
Yeah.
Not, coming from a sport culture where we're taught and conditioned to push them aside and really compartmentalize, check. And then learning how to be vulnerable. Like, I think that's like, that topic comes up so much in my interviews about like, what skills do we develop in sport that really is important within that context and to achieving a certain amount of performance. And then how do we have to like retrain ourselves when it comes to like our personal lives, especially like interpersonally. I think I'm just like blown away at the information that learning a little bit more about your background, reading what's on paper, which obviously is not only representative of how, who the person is, but then hearing some of these interviews. And I was like, really, like my hypothesis was totally wrong. Like I really thought that, because in some of these other interviews, and I also want to give credit where credit is due. I listened to Polina's interview with you. I also listened to another interview with the Pediatric Sports Medicine podcast. Yeah. Both great interviews. And, you also talked about your parents and how they really, focused on developing you as a person. And yet I'm like still shocked that you had a difficult time, because in those interviews and those conversations, it did come off as though the transition, while hard, you were able to like really navigate. So I guess the next question is it how the person asks, or is it that we really need to be asking the right questions and in terms of, or how different questions lead to different answers? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so to some extent, right? Like the way in which we're talking about transition out of sport is different in different contexts. One of the things that I think when we're talking about transition out of sport, it can feel hard to kind of present that, in the right setting. It's like, when we've talked about this kind of offline, there's certainly this mutual understanding of like what that experience is really like. And when you're talking about it publicly, when you're talking about it personally, like sometimes there's just different frames that can be helpful for different folks. So, certainly with talking with Paulina, there's a lot of information around like what that experience was like from truly like a skating lens, and then how that kind of translates to like what I'm doing currently as a clinical psych Ph.D. student who's studying eating disorders. So, it's definitely a matter of timing. It's a matter of the types of questions that are asked. And it's a matter of like how people want to frame this subject. I think sometimes there's this pressure to present that, again, like everything was just fine and dandy when you retired, and as I have gone deeper into like practicing with clients and learning certain, psychology treatment models, it's like I also recognize like the power of vulnerability now in these kinds of interviews. And, while I want to support my clients the best way possible, through those like evidence-based frameworks, at the same time, like I also have to do my own digging to understand like my vulnerabilities, my biases, whether that's from a sport context, a multicultural background, like, it's just, there's a lot of different avenues that this work kind of allows you to do. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of different complexities and nuances to this conversation that the more I kind of distance myself from my own retirement, the more I can look back and reflect and understand like, yeah, I was actually really struggling and I have to kind of own up to that.
Yeah. I mean, because you're much younger than I am, but I think around your time was when I actually just started therapy. And so it seems like in terms of like processing your retirement, you're actually further along in the timeline than I am, because I was really, I was tired. I knew what I was doing wasn't right. And I didn't realize that so much of it was connected to just having to leave sport and leave that identity and redefine yourself. And it's really like starting over. I mean, sure, like our skills will transfer, but I mean, no matter what we do, we're starting from scratch, really, at least from a skill development perspective, whether it's in medicine, whether it's in psychology, or somebody else even going to investment banking, you got to start somewhere. And I think that's an overwhelming thing, because maybe you have reached such a high level. You started figure skating at what, like 4?
Yeah. Yep. That's all I knew.
So yeah. So what period, when you reflect back on your experience, I know you mentioned that year after graduating, but can you remember a specific moment that was like, man, this is brutal. Like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do next.
Yeah. There's one snapshot in particular that probably two snapshots that I have kind of logged in my brain as like, those were definitely moments where I was really having a hard time. One was I was sitting with Eric, my now husband, and we were just kind of sitting on a couch at my apartment, and I was coming to terms with the fact that I didn't want to follow through with applying to medical school. And even though that was the context of the conversation, what was really happening was I was struggling with kind of this identity piece. Like, what do I do now? Like, who am I without this, kind of prescribed academic path, and without this like sport background that has just, when I was going through high school, when I was going through college, like everyone was like, oh, that's the Olympic ice skater. And so that was how I even knew myself in many ways. And I just remember sitting there just bawling with him. And, I didn't necessarily share at that point with him that was kind of the real piece of that conversation. But it was kind of couched in this medical school conversation. And
probably didn't have the language to kind of articulate that. I certainly didn't.
Yeah. And I don't think I even had the insight yet at that point. Yeah. Like, I just knew that, like you said, something was just off and I felt broken. And I remember talking about this in another view, and also in another interview, and also with my Ph.D. advisor. We were talking about how sometimes sport can feel like a really terrible kind of divorce, or even like a death of like a part of yourself, especially if it's something that you have it's just like ingrained in every fiber of your being. It's just who you are. And so that felt like one of those moments where I really came to terms with that. And then there was a second point where I was going in to go coach one morning, and this was kind of in that same like year time span. I was going in to go coach before I was starting to work at a research lab. And I remember pulling into the parking lot, and it was, like 5:30, 6:00 in the morning, completely dark outside. And I was sitting in my car and I just couldn't get out of my car. I was like, I can't go into the rink this morning. And, I was really upset. The mom of the skater I was supposed to go coach, like pulled in next to me after coming in with some Starbucks coffee. And she just saw me sitting there and she was like, you need to go home. You need to go home and you need to just take the day off and like take care of yourself, And it was one of those like just really empathetic and compassionate moments where I was like, thank you so much. Like I didn't even need to tell you what was happening. You just saw and you're like, you need to like take some, kind of TLC time to yourself. And I was so, so thankful for her in that moment, because it just was like, okay, someone sees me, even though they don't necessarily know what's going on, they're seeing me and they're understanding that I'm really hurt and struggling right now. So yeah, those are the two kind of snapshots that always come to my mind when I think about like that period. And yeah, I just feel so, so grateful that I had really good support systems in place with Eric and with my family and with some of my friends, who just knew that even though I was struggling, and even if I wasn't sharing 100% of what was happening at that point in time, that they would be there for me and be there whenever I was ready to talk about it. So yeah, it was really interesting. And fortunately, like giving me that space and time allowed me to like take the pressure off and figure out what was next. And that started kind of this whole, that kicked off this domino effect of me starting to do research in this eating disorder digital tech lab in the Bay Area, and completely falling in love with the research and with the clinical work, and then deciding now to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology. So I think it all worked out like it was supposed to, even though it was a difficult period for sure.
It always does kind of, hopefully, I can't say that for everybody's journey, but I think for the most part, a lot of things do fall into place and they eventually work out. And I think the thing that's important to realize is like the path of the pieces falling into place is not just all the bright and sunny and happy, shiny aspects, right? Like the part of the process is the struggle and the adversity and the really, really bad moments. And I think that there's something particularly in American and Western society where it's like, oh, we would just want like the happy part, but this other part is really critical. And so thank you for sharing those two moments. So what a gift from that mother, like that she like noticed that from you. And then the death component. Yeah. I mean, I always kind of mention that old adage of every athlete dies twice. The first occurs upon retirement. And that adage has been around for decades. So, coming into this interview, I've kind of had, from an anecdotal perspective, like this idea that Olympic athletes specifically seem to really struggle in leaving sport, maybe compared to others. Do you feel what do you feel about that thought or hypothesis?
Yeah, it's probably true. I mean, putting my research hat on, I'm like, but like clinically,
let me go look at this right now.
I know. These are the many hats that I wear on a daily basis, right? But it's also really cool to kind of have those different perspectives now. But yeah, of course, anecdotally, I think a lot of Olympians and Paralympians and athletes who are just at that top 0.01% of sport, you have to be incredibly committed and dedicated to be at that level. And so, sometimes there's like obsessive components. There's, this really intense commitment to not only the amount of time and effort that it requires, but just the emotional like dedication and kind, of this identity piece. Like you have to believe that this is what you were meant to do and that's who you are. So I think those kinds of combinations like inherently lend themselves to really having to take a lot of time to disentangle from that experience and even kind of the personality that it requires. It's funny kind of going through this program. Sometimes some of my friends are like, wow, you seem, like sometimes these elite athletes, like I would imagine you being so intense and like, so, so like with it and really committed and competitive. I'm like, oh yeah, don't worry. That part is still there. That hasn't gone away. But now it's just, now I am able to balance that part of my identity and personality and that kind of, I can tap into that when I need it because I knew that I have that in my back pocket from my experiences in sport. So so all that to say, I think sometimes that can kind of lend itself to a more difficult transition out, especially when it inherently just the amount of time that it takes to achieve that level in sport minimizes the amount of time that you can pursue other things in your life. So you got to fill the gaps. You have to rebuild a little bit. You have to rediscover who you are. And it takes a lot of strength and vulnerability and like willingness to do that because sometimes people aren't able to retire on their own terms, which I think complicates that picture even more.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I think that the voluntary retirement versus involuntary retirement certainly affects how people leave sport. Mm-hmm. But I think it's even a powerful and significant point that even for somebody like you who've reached such a high level and achieved the success that you did, and in many ways, while your last performance may have not been the perfect one or whatnot, but it sounds like you really had control over your narrative. But still, even then, it was still hard for you. And so then that hopefully that validates other athletes' experiences. Like no matter what, it's probably going to be really hard. And so I think my next question for you within the context of this topic is, how were you able to recover and repair? And hopefully I framed the question less about like finding your next purpose because, right? Because it's like, I don't want, even though what I did too is like immediately jump into the next thing, but maybe from like, and it's like, oh, I'm totally fine. And you're like, oh, I'm not. But from maybe like a more psychological, emotional perspective, how did you recover and repair?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think it was I think it was a number of things. One of the key components though, and I keep coming back to this, was like that social and family support. Their willingness to not push me when I wasn't ready to talk about it, I think was really helpful in, like I said before, kind of alleviating some of that pressure to fix it right away. I'm such a problem solver that I'm like, here are the next steps that I need to do. And, great, it'll be all sorted out. And, and so I think that was one of the first experiences for me where I really had to start listening to my emotions and acknowledge the fact that there was some grief and loss in that process. And, even I can think about a time when Eric and I were like making the bed upstairs a couple months ago. And I just had like some realization about my career and that retirement process. And it was one of those moments where I was like, wow, yeah, I really was struggling. Like I just wasn't even willing to acknowledge that sometimes because I wanted to, I just wanted to move on to what was next. And so I think there's that social support, there's that willingness to like experience those emotions and kind of be and sit with yourself in that. But also giving yourself like the time and the space. I think I was less inclined to do that because of who I am and my desire to just problem solve and move on. But in looking back, when I was really taking the time, like taking that day off after, trying to go to coach and just not even being able to get out of my car, that was one of those days where I had good insights. I had good reflections, and spent some time just kind of cataloging like some of these experiences that I've had and reflecting both positively on my skating career, but also understanding that there were a lot of challenges and that it wasn't just good or bad, right? Like there was so much gray in that and so much color in that experience. So yeah. So I think the social support, the willingness to kind of sit with it and taking that time and space, those were kind of the three things that I think really helped me navigate some of that.
Yeah. And the social support is so important. And some of that social support is kind of having to reach out.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a really hard thing that I really had to, I mean, even still today at 41 years old, I'm still having to retrain my mind because as a tennis player, it's like, I can't reach out. Like we don't have any coaches. We're not allowed to be coached typically. You're by yourself for the most part. So for me, it's a skill that's ever evolving. Really hope you enjoyed today's conversation. For more episodes, just visit our show page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. And also to watch the full version of these interviews, you can head on over to YouTube. Just search for the show name, The Next Chapter with Prim Siripipat. Of course, subscribe to us, like us, give us a star rating because we really appreciate you listening and also showing your support. And you can also follow me on all the social media platforms, including Twitter and Instagram at Prim_Siripipat. The Next Chapter with Prim Siripipat is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.